Mikhail Gorbachev sits alone in his Kremlin office. He is the last leader of the Soviet Union, and he is about to sign a document that will erase a global superpower from existence. But here's what haunts historians. Exactly 900 days earlier, nobody, not the CIA, not Soviet generals, not even Gorbachev himself, believed this moment was possible. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it looked strong. Doesn't make sense, right? But by the end of this video, you'll understand why that impossible contradiction is the most dangerous economic pattern in history. Because right now, in 2025, America is showing the exact same symptoms the USSR displayed in year one of its 900-day countdown. Not similar symptoms, not comparable patterns, the exact same sequence. Like a disease following a textbook progression. But there's something even stranger. Buried in declassified KGB documents from 1990 is a single-page analysis that predicted the collapse with perfect accuracy. The analyst who wrote it was ignored, dismissed as a paranoid pessimist. His model had three markers, three unmistakable signs that a superpower has entered its final countdown. The Soviet Union hit all three. America has hit two of them in the last 36 months. The third one, it comes without warnings. And the only people who survive it are the ones who position themselves before the crowd realized something was wrong. Before we go further, you need to understand what that KGB analyst discovered. He wasn't looking at military strength or technological advancement. He was tracking something far more fundamental: the psychological and economic patterns that appear when empires enter terminal decline. His model identified three sequential markers. The terrifying part is, once marker 1 triggers, you have roughly 900 days until complete systemic collapse, and each marker makes the next one inevitable. The Soviet Union hit marker 1 in March 1989. The flag came down in December 1991. 900 days, almost to the week. So let me take you back to 1988, when the Soviet Union looked invincible, and show you exactly how the countdown began. Because once you see the pattern in the USSR, you'll recognize it instantly in America today. Marker 1. Summer of 1988. The Soviet Union is the world's second superpower. Nuclear arsenal rivaling America's. Military stretched across 3 continents. 15 republics bound by ideology and force. An economy that, on paper, rivals the largest in the world. The leadership is confident. Gorbachev has initiated reforms that he believes will strengthen the system. The West is cautiously optimistic. Soviet officials speak about the future with certainty. But beneath the surface, something is already breaking. The first crack appears in the minds of the people being controlled. For 44 years, Soviet troops had dominated Eastern Europe. Every rebellion had been crushed with tanks and blood. The message was clear: resistance is futile. The Soviet system is permanent. Then came March 1989. Poland held semi-free elections. Solidarity, a banned trade union, and illegal opposition movement won 99 out of 100 available seats in the Senate, a complete, undeniable landslide. And Moscow did nothing, not because they were merciful, not because they'd suddenly embraced democracy, but because they were paralyzed. The economic cost of intervention had become unbearable. The diplomatic cost was too high. The military was overstretched. But here's what matters. Within weeks, every country in the Eastern Bloc realized the same thing simultaneously. The empire was exhausted. For decades, the Soviet Union had stretched itself across the globe. Military commitments in Cuba, Angola, Ethiopia, Syria, Vietnam, troops occupying Eastern Europe, naval fleets patrolling 3 oceans, and then Afghanistan, a bleeding wound that consumed $8 billion annually and 15,000 Soviet lives. By 1989, the military apparatus that once inspired fear had become an anchor. The cost of maintaining empire, the troop deployments, the proxy wars, the satellite states had drained the treasury dry. The Soviet military consumed 20% of GDP, possibly more. Nobody knew the real numbers because the statistics were fabricated. Then came the test. Poland held elections. Solidarity won, and Moscow, the empire that had crushed Hungarian rebels with tanks in '56, that had invaded Czechoslovakia in '68, that had threatened the world with nuclear annihilation, did nothing. Not because they'd become peaceful, but because they were broke. The cost of intervention, military, economic, diplomatic, had become unbearable for an economy already hemorrhaging from a decade of imperial overreach. And within weeks, every occupied nation realized the same thing. The empire couldn't enforce its own rules anymore. This was marker 1. The legitimacy fracture. It wasn't about military defeat. It was about exhaustion. The Soviet Union had worn itself out trying to be everywhere, control everything, project power it could no longer afford. The story of Soviet invincibility, the narrative that had held the empire together through sheer force, had shattered the moment they proved too tired to pull the trigger. And once enough people recognized that exhaustion, simultaneously, the cascade began. Hungary opened its borders in May. Czechoslovakia's government fell in November. East Germany opened the Berlin Wall on November 9th, not because anyone ordered it, but because guards simply stopped defending it. The empire was evaporating in real time. By the end of 1989, Marker 1 was complete. The Soviet Union still existed on maps. The military still functioned. The government still issued orders. But the legitimacy, the belief in inevitability, was gone. The countdown had begun. Marker 2. Marker 1 destroys belief. Marker 2 destroys options. By 1990, the Soviet economic system entered what analysts call terminal spiral. Let me show you how it worked. The USSR's economy was always fragile, held together by oil revenues and central planning. But in 1986, oil prices collapsed from $30 to $10 per barrel. The primary source of hard currency, gone. The Soviet response, print more rubles, borrow harder, pray the system stabilizes. They didn't have a choice. Central planning created obligations, wages for millions of workers, subsidies for failing industries, military contracts that couldn't be canceled without political rebellion. Cutting spending meant admitting the system had failed. So they expanded the money supply. They increased foreign debt. They kept printing. And inflation devoured everything. By mid-1990, the official ruble was becoming worthless. Black markets exploded. Citizens stopped using state currency and started bartering. Regional governments began printing their own money because Moscow's paper was useless. But here's the critical insight. Marker 2 isn't about the numbers. It's about the loss of options. The Soviet Union couldn't stop printing because stopping meant instant collapse. They couldn't cut military spending because that meant losing superpower status. They couldn't reform the economy because the economy was the political system. Every possible move led to catastrophe. So they chose paralysis, delay, and hope for a miracle. Marker 2 was complete by late 1990. The economic system was running on fumes. The government had no moves left, except printing and lying. The empire had maybe 12 months remaining. They just didn't know it yet. Marker 3, August 19th, 1991. A group of Soviet hardliners, desperate to save the system, attempted a coup. They arrested Gorbachev, deployed tanks to Moscow, and declared a state of emergency. The coup failed within 72 hours. Not because the military fought back, not because of mass protests, but because nobody obeyed. Regional governments ignored orders from Moscow. Soldiers refused to shoot civilians. Local officials made decisions independently. The central authority issued commands, and the periphery simply said no. This was Marker 3, the Cascade. It's the moment when everyone realizes simultaneously that the emperor has no power. Authority doesn't gradually erode, it evaporates instantly, like water reaching boiling point. Once Marker 3 triggers, collapse is no longer a possibility, it's an inevitability. The Soviet Union technically lasted 4 more months after the coup failed, but it was already over. Gorbachev's resignation on December 25th was just paperwork. The flag came down at 7:32 p.m. Moscow time. From Marker 1 in March 1989 to dissolution in December 1991, approximately 900 days. 3 markers, 1 pattern, inevitable progression. Now here's why this should terrify you. America has entered the exact same sequence, and we need to talk about when the clock started ticking. Let's start with the moment that historians might point to decades from now as America's March 1989. It happened in 2022. For 70 years, American economic dominance has rested on one foundation: the dollar as the world's reserve currency. This wasn't just about trade, it was about power. It meant that global demand for dollars allowed America to print money, run deficits, and fund its empire without the immediate consequences other nations would face. It worked because the world believed it was inevitable. Then came the sanctions of 2022. America weaponized the dollar system, freezing reserves, cutting access to SWIFT, using financial infrastructure as a weapon. It was meant as a show of strength. Look what we can do. Comply or be destroyed. But the world saw something different. They saw risk. If reserve currency status could be revoked as a weapon, then holding dollars was no longer safe. It was a vulnerability. And for the first time in decades, major powers began asking, what are our alternatives? Saudi Arabia, America's anchor in the petrodollar system since 1974, took meetings in Beijing about trading oil in yuan. India bought Russian oil despite Western pressure. Brazil and Argentina discussed settling trade in their own currencies. These weren't just economic transactions, they were legitimacy tests. And the results showed that American financial hegemony was no longer seen as inevitable. By 2023, China and Brazil completed their first yuan-real trade settlement, bypassing the dollar entirely. France completed an LNG transaction in yuan. The BRICS nations openly discussed creating alternative payment systems. The legitimacy fracture had begun. Just like Poland's election in 1989 revealed that Soviet control was optional, these currency moves revealed that dollar dominance was negotiable. Marker 1 triggered. The belief in American economic invincibility, the psychological foundation that held the system together, began cracking. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that the pattern had begun, which means we should be watching very carefully for Marker 2. Marker 2 is about economics. Specifically, it's about the moment when a nation runs out of good options. Let me show you where America stands. Total dollars in circulation increased by 40% between 2020 and 2022. 40% in 2 years. The kind of monetary expansion that appears in textbooks under warnings of collapse. National debt crossed $34 trillion in 2024. Debt to GDP ratio exceeds 120%. But here's the truly catastrophic number. Interest payments on that debt now consume over $1 trillion annually, more than the entire defense budget. This creates an impossible trap. If the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates high to fight inflation, debt service costs explode and the government must borrow even more to pay interest on existing debt. If they lower rates to reduce debt costs, inflation accelerates and the dollar's purchasing power evaporates. There are no good moves, only bad choices and worse ones. This is exactly what the USSR faced in 1990. Print more and destroy the currency, or stop printing and collapse the system. The American response has been identical to the Soviet response: delay. Print selectively. Pray something changes. In 2023, when regional banks began failing, the Fed created new facilities to inject liquidity, essentially printing money while claiming they weren't printing money. When the debt ceiling crisis hit, the solution was to suspend the ceiling and borrow more. Every crisis is met with the same solution: expand the balance sheet, increase the debt, extend and pretend. This is Marker 2. Terminal economics, the point where policy becomes purely reactive, where you're no longer steering the ship, you're just trying to keep it from sinking for one more quarter. The USSR had about 14 months between Marker 2 fully triggering and final collapse. America's Marker 2, we're watching it happen in real time. The moment of full trigger will be when a real crisis hits and the government discovers it has no tools left, no room to cut rates, no credibility to print, no ability to borrow. That moment is coming, and when it arrives, we'll have roughly 12 to 18 months until Marker 3. Marker 3 is different from the first two. You can see Marker 1 coming. Legitimacy fractures slowly, then suddenly. You can track Marker 2. Economic metrics tell the story. But Marker 3, you won't know it's happening until it's already complete. Let me explain what the cascade looks like. In the Soviet Union, Marker 3 triggered during the August 1991 coup attempt. Hardliners tried to seize control, and the entire system simply didn't respond. Orders were issued, nobody followed them. It wasn't a rebellion, it was recognition that the center was powerless. In America, Marker 3 won't look like a coup. The system is too decentralized for that. Instead, it will look like this. A routine treasury auction fails to attract sufficient buyers at acceptable rates. To cover the shortfall, the Fed is forced into emergency monetization, direct money printing visible to all. Markets see the emperor has no clothes. Within 48 hours, yields spike across the curve. Mortgage rates hit 12%, corporate debt markets freeze, pension funds face insolvency. The government can no longer borrow at sustainable rates, forcing immediate austerity or hyperinflationary printing. The choice itself triggers the cascade. BRICS nations launch a gold-backed trade settlement currency, not to replace the dollar globally, but to settle 40% of global trade outside dollar systems. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Indonesia immediately join. Within 6 months, oil trades shift dramatically toward the new system. Dollar demand collapses 30%. The Fed faces impossible choice: defend the dollar with rate hikes that destroy the economy, or accept devaluation that triggers inflation spiral. Either choice triggers cascade as markets realize the Fed is out of policy options. The specific trigger doesn't matter. What matters is the cascade effect, the moment when enough critical actors simultaneously realize that the center cannot hold, and they act on that realization at the same time. That's when Marker 3 triggers. And once it does, collapse becomes not a prediction, but a certainty. The terrifying part? You won't recognize it while it's happening. The Soviet people didn't know August 1991 was the end. They thought it was just another crisis, another problem the system would solve like it always had. Even in December, Soviet citizens were making plans for 1992 as if nothing fundamental would change. But the empire was already gone. The rest was just paperwork. This is FinArchive. We don't just tell stories about the past, we decode the patterns before they complete. Subscribe now.